We're excited about the series that we're beginning today. It's called You Asked For It. And several weeks ago, we passed out some cards and we asked you as a congregation, okay, what are some topics that you would like for us as a staff to speak about? And so obviously the past couple of weeks, 3 weeks or so, has been very interesting in regards to religious liberty issues and things that are going on in our country. And so one of the questions that was asked, actually it was at the top of the list, and that's one of the reasons why we decided to start with the question today is, what does the Bible say about homosexuality and gay marriage? And taking it a step further, how should we as believers in Jesus Christ respond to the Supreme Court's decision? And so me as your pastor, I'm not one of those who will shy away from a question. I like to hit things head on. And so I'm very privileged to have a friend of mine, Dr. Barrett Duke, here with us today. And he is the Vice President for Public Policy and Research, and he's the director of the Research Institute of the Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so he, more than anyone that I know personally, deals with these issues on a daily basis. And so I thought, well, I'm going to ask him and see if he's open and his schedule will permit him to come in and share with us his thoughts on what's going on in our country and so forth. And I'm just, Dr. Duke, I'm so thankful for you to be here. It's, it's interesting. A year ago, he invited me to come to this Capitol briefing, okay? And so I'm like, I knew that I was going to have to put a suit on, and I got my nice cufflinks and all that kind of stuff. You rarely see me in a suit. So,
but it looked good.
Yeah, that's right. So he said, you'll be one of, several pastors that are going to be, this Capitol briefing. There's going to be all these people there. And so I went down there, and they treated us, Dr. Duke, you guys treated us like royalty, these pastors. And now what you have to understand, it was right after the Southern Baptist Convention took place in Baltimore. And so all these, what I would call like big time pastors in the Southern Baptist Convention are there. Like the newly elected president of the Southern Baptist Convention, because there was only about 15 or 20 pastors. And I was one of those pastors that was there. And I'm thinking, who am I, to be here? I mean, I'm sitting in the Capitol hearing these guys come in and talk, like Marco Rubio, and I believe Mitch McConnell, I think, spoke.
Yep.
And is it Fred Wolf? He retired. Is it Fred or Frank? I can't remember.
Frank.
Okay, Frank.
Yep.
And then it was interesting because one of the guys that I knew as a kid, he actually used to be the governor of Tennessee, and I actually have a picture of him when he was walking around Tennessee wearing this black and red plaid shirt. Lamar Alexander, he's a senator from Tennessee. He spoke, and then Eric Cantor spoke. If you remember Eric Cantor, he lost that election to that Tea Party candidate, and that was like maybe 2 days after that. So. Yep. Regardless of that, here's the thing, okay? We live in this social media world, and you can't really do anything anymore without getting noticed. So I'm there. I'm just thinking I'm just there hanging out, with Dr. Duke and these pastors. Well, I start getting like all these texts and like emails from my friends. What are you doing with Dr. Ronnie Floyd, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention? What's going on? Why are you there? So it was like, it was kind of like, I guess you would call it a Forrest Gump moment or whatever. I was kind of, it was like a photo bomb, every time that I would reach and get in the photos. But anyway, it was a great time. I had a great time, Dr. Duke. I appreciate you inviting me to that. But we are here to talk about a very difficult and controversial topic. But I think it would be good for our people to, if you don't mind, just kind of share a little bit about what you do, even more in depth with the Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission.
Sure. I direct the Washington, D.C. office for the Southern Baptist Convention. It's the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission is our moral concerns group that's supported and charged by the Southern Baptist Convention to address moral and cultural issues. We speak to the church about the issues, try to educate Christians about moral and cultural issues, public policy issues of the day. And then we also speak to government, all three branches of government, and try to help our elected officials and others pass laws and develop policies that are in line with biblical values. So I spend a good bit of my day visiting with congressmen or senators or their staff or different folks in the administration, talking to them about what Southern Baptists believe, what the Bible teaches, and the kinds of things that we believe they should be supporting in order to have a government and have a country that brings honor to God.
That's great. Well, I mean, I think I don't want to take away from our time, but let's just kind of just dive into talking about the subject that we have at hand here. I know you spoke here, I think it was 2 years ago, and if anybody wants to watch that entire message, you did a great job in talking about what the Bible has to say about homosexuality and gay marriage, and quite frankly, what you shared that day it was kind of a prophetic message in a sense, because you said it's coming. I remember you saying that in your message, but for the sake of time, because we're also going to open it up for some Q&A at the end. I mean, just kind of in a nutshell, can you share with us a little bit about what the Bible does say about homosexuality and gay marriage?
Yeah, sure. I think it's very clear. The Bible teaches that there is only one appropriate environment for sexual activity, and that's within marriage. And the Bible makes it very clear that marriage is the union of a man and a woman. Nothing else is marriage, and so there's no other appropriate place by God's design for sexual activity to take place. With homosexuality, as you know, that is not what happens. And the Bible makes it very clear that the homosexual behavior is sinful behavior. Just like any other kind of sexual behavior outside of marriage is also sinful, but homosexual behavior is sinful behavior according to the teaching of Scripture. You can find it in the book of Leviticus, chapter 18. And in case people are wondering, well, yeah, okay, well, that's the Old Testament. You know, we got released from that.
Right.
Well, Paul teaches the same thing in Romans chapter 1, still, that God has a design for humanity and for the appropriate place for sexual activity to take place, and that's between a man and a woman in a marital relationship, not between a man and a man, not between a woman and a woman. And so we just turn to the Scripture and we see, even though we recognize that same-sex attraction exists, I think it arises for a number of different reasons. I think there is some genetic causation to it, but nobody has found a homosexual gene. As hard as they've looked, they haven't found it. I think a lot of it has to do with environment, just what's happened to you as you've grown up and your experiences growing up. We know that there are certain things that are fairly common for people who develop same-sex attraction. And so the Bible isn't unsympathetic to the reality of people's brokenness. Right. And this is basically a form of brokenness that some people are dealing with. But at the same time, the Bible doesn't say, okay, because you're dealing with this brokenness, therefore it's okay to embrace it. So what we try to do is we try to help people understand that we recognize that you have same-sex attraction, and we believe God wants to help you with that, but we can't simply change God's design in order to accommodate your current brokenness. And so we continue to encourage people to find God, find God's healing for their same-sex attraction, and then also try to still hold forward God's design for sexuality.
When you look at, I mean, you mentioned the Bible and some scripture verses there. You know, you look at the Bible, you look at history, you know, psychology and nature. You can make an argument to say that all of those argue for marriage between a man and a woman. You know, why do you believe that there is such a controversy today? Why do you think that there is such that?
Well, I think a good bit of our country has simply moved away from biblical teachings. They no longer believe this book actually is the Word of God, so they look for a different source of authority, and they're turning to science as a source of authority. They're turning to their own feelings and their own opinions as their primary source of authority. And the result is, as they move away from God's truth, they are embracing fallen sources for understanding truth. That doesn't mean that you can't find truth outside of the Bible, right. But if what you think you have found is true, and yet it contradicts biblical teaching, then you haven't really found truth.
Right.
The Bible helps to confirm whether or not what you believe is true, but people are rejecting biblical teaching now, and they're looking to other sources, and they have these experiences. They have same-sex attraction. That's real for them, and they're trying to understand, okay, I have these same-sex attractions, where did they come from, and how am I supposed to understand them? And they explain to you and me, and they explain to us that this is the only thing I know.
Right.
And for them, that's their reality. And they try to help us understand that that's their reality, and we should sympathize with that, because that is their reality. That's all they know. Nobody that I know of decided one day they're going to be homosexual. It's something that they actually struggled with for many years before they finally gave in to those attractions. So we have to accept the reality that they have same-sex attraction. They don't know where it came from, but that's their reality.
Right.
And so that's what they're working from, and they're trying to figure out, okay, how can I live in this society with these feelings and with these attractions in a way that causes me to feel affirmed and enables me to live in the same way that everybody else lives. And other people are trying to accommodate them in that and trying to find a way to make that possible for them.
Well, I know it's been, obviously it's been in the news, it's been on the headlines. I remember when I read on USA Today and CNN and Fox about the Supreme Court's decision, it was kind of, like I just felt kind of deflated, in a sense. But, and I know in talking with people over the past couple of weeks, I mean, there's a range of different emotions, but how would you encourage us as Christians? How should we as believers in Jesus Christ, how should we respond to the Supreme Court's decision?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's right to panic.
Right.
I think we need to recognize that we have moved into space that certainly the American church hasn't experienced before. This is new space for us, so we have to try to figure out how we continue to live in a society that is accepting homosexuality, that has decided, at least our courts, but quite frankly, a large part of the rest of America as well, is prepared to accept same-sex marriage. And we have to accept that is now part of the American experience. But we don't panic, because we know we still have a God who is able to guide his church to live in this environment and to be victorious and successful in this environment, as it's been for 2,000 years. It's a different situation now. And the church needs to prepare itself. You need to make sure that your church has appropriate kinds of guidance in place, appropriate kinds of policies in place that help protect you as people are trying to move your church to become accommodating and accepting of homosexuality.
Right.
So we need to prepare ourselves to be able to live in a way that enables us to continue to function as a God-honoring church. But we shouldn't think that we need to run from society. We shouldn't think that we have to now build our walls higher and thicker. We just have to make sure we have an answer to the current kinds of questions that are being asked.
And that kind of leads into the next question I had for you. What impact do you believe the decision will have on churches and Christians?
I think churches are going to be challenged. I don't think there's any doubt. We're going to find there is a certain segment of the homosexual lobby that is determined to force acceptance by everybody. Now, I don't think that's the majority of the homosexual community, but there are some who are very militant in the way they're going about forcing acceptance. So I think that's a very real reality for us, and we need to recognize that there will be some folks who are going to be militant about this, and we need to make sure we prepare for that. And so it does change our reality.
I mean, you deal with this every day. One of the things that I was thinking about this past week that I wanted to get your thoughts on, I mean, you may know some specific instances. I mean, have you seen persecution for Christians who stood up for their beliefs, in regards to this? And for example, like, have you heard of any businesses or even churches that have been persecuted for standing up for what the Bible clearly teaches about marriage?
Yeah, there are a number of examples. Perhaps the most prominent one right now today is Baron Stutzman, who is a florist in Washington State, and she provided floral arrangements for all kinds of customers, including homosexual customers. But at one point, these regular customers came to her and said, "Would you provide flowers for our same-sex wedding?" And at that point, Baronelle, whom I've met and talked with, a very fine, godly, loving, gentle woman, said, "You know what? My beliefs as a Christian tell me that marriage is only the union of a man and a woman. And I can't, in good conscience, provide floral arrangements for your same-sex wedding." And so she was honest with them, and she said, I can't do that. She said, "I can sell you flowers as you come in, but I can't create wedding arrangements, floral arrangements for your wedding." And so she refused to do so. They brought her up on charges because the state has a sexual orientation law that says you can't discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. And she was fined. And she's right now under, I think it's like $135,000 fine, simply because she said, as a Christian, I can't be involved in that. There's a case of photographers in New Mexico. There's a t-shirt maker in Kentucky. These stories are becoming more and more regular for us as people of faith in the business community. Right now it's happening mostly in the business community as people are trying to operate their businesses according to their biblical values. And people are coming in, homosexuals are coming in and challenging their ability to run their businesses according to their biblical values. And so we are seeing that. We're going to see more of that, without a doubt, now that the Supreme Court has ruled in this particular case. And it's going to become even more difficult for people of faith to provide certain services to the public and be faithful in their calling before God.
That goes into the next question that I was going to ask you about. When it comes to our religious liberties, I know, and maybe you would want to speak to the First Amendment. That's something that you hear talked about a lot when it comes to churches and Christians. One of the things that I've had people ask me, and I know you're not a lawyer, but you deal with this on a daily basis, but I've had people even come up to me and say, okay, if even us having this kind of discussion right here, talking about what the Bible says about, biblical marriage, churches are at risk of losing their tax exempt status. I've heard of pastors say, we're no longer going to do marriages anymore. Right. We're just going to encourage people to go down to the courthouse, the justice of the peace, and then we'll do like a little religious ceremony for you. Because, quite frankly, there's a lot of people who are nervous and scared about this. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think this conversation right here is perfectly within the limits of what being a 501c3 nonprofit corporation is able to do. You can talk on this. You can talk about your concerns about particular bills even, and be safe. The only thing you can't really do without the potential, it's mostly just the potential that the government might question you, is endorse a candidate for public office, say from the pulpit. Other than that, you're free to talk about the issues, your convictions on the issues, without any danger from that. So this conversation, you don't have anything to worry about, okay? This is a legal conversation that we're having right now.
All right. Well, I would ask you this. You mentioned that that a lot of people struggle with homosexuality. If homosexuality is a struggle for someone, what do you recommend that they do?
Yeah, I think it's important that we recognize. I get nervous when people say, those people chose that lifestyle, because I think they're showing a lack of understanding of the source of same-sex attraction. It is true that a person who is practicing homosexuality has chosen to practice homosexual behavior. I mean, that still is a choice. But the same-sex attraction isn't something that they choose. And I think we need to speak in a more nuanced way, in a more compassionate way about folks who are struggling with same-sex attraction, and understand that they're dealing with something that they don't understand, just like other people are dealing with things that they don't understand as well. We all have certain sinful inclinations that we're dealing with. That happens to be theirs. It may not be their only one, but that happens to be theirs. You know, I have mine, you have yours. Everybody has their particular areas of weakness or temptation. We have to start there. We have to start with the reality that's part of what it means to be fallen. Right. That certain things are going on within us that we don't understand. It doesn't mean, however, that we are therefore free to simply act on all of that. I mean, imagine what would happen if all of us simply acted on every inclination that we had. You know, we'd be an absolute mess.
That's right.
So we have to trust in the power of the Spirit to continue to transform us through the work of God in our lives, and let God basically rewrite the tapes in our minds to get us to change, you know, the way we would naturally behave. And we need to help folks who are struggling with same-sex attraction find their way to God, so that God can help them overcome those same-sex attractions as well, and let God bring them the emotional and the psychological healing that's necessary for them to overcome whatever it is that's going on in their lives that causes them to be attracted to people of the same sex. So we shouldn't be condemning of the individual. We need to be, I think, compassionate toward the individual, but we don't help them by affirming that activity. If we affirm the activity, we're actually affirming them in their sinfulness and making it even harder for them to understand that God has something better for them than what they currently have. So as a church, we need to be compassionate, but we also need to be firm in the way we speak about it. And we shouldn't basically try to accommodate homosexuals any more than we try to accommodate other people in sinful behaviors in order to make them feel affirmed or wanted or loved. But we should also make sure that the church is a place where they can come and begin to find the healing that they need. I mean, the church should be a safe space for people struggling with same-sex attraction who want to move beyond that, not to come into the church and practice homosexual behavior, but it should be a place for people who are trying to overcome same-sex attraction. They should be able to come into a safe space like this, find the help, find the love that they need for God to do that work in their lives.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that you know, if you know, we deal with people every day, and one of the things that I have heard over the years is that, well, you know, Jeff, what's the big deal? I mean, why are you making such a big deal out of this? You know, it's okay for them to think that way as long as they're not bothering me. I mean, why, Jeff? Why are you making such a big deal? You know, if that's what they want to do, you know, let them do it. You know, how should we respond to people who have that kind of mentality?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things that we need to say. First of all, they are free to engage in homosexual activity. Now, we shouldn't be regulating what happens in the bedroom between consenting adults. Right. So I think that's appropriate, and they are free to do that. But that doesn't mean that we should say that's okay. Right. If we believe this book, in God's eyes, that's not okay. That's right. That's sinful activity. And if we simply say, okay, you go on and do that, you know, that's okay. You just go do what you want to do, and we'll leave you alone. You leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. That runs contrary to God's call to us to call all people to faith in Christ, to call them all out of their sin into holiness. And so if we simply let them go do what they want to do, why don't we just do that for everybody? You know, why don't we just simply stop preaching the gospel? If it's simply about let's just get along with everybody, then we basically have to say, okay, I'm just going to stop doing what the prophets did. I'm going to stop doing what Jesus told me to do, which is to be salt and light, to point out sin, to call people to faithfulness, to call people to holiness. Right. So I would have to I would have to stop doing what God has called me as a disciple to do, to simply let them go do what they want to do. But there's also another side of this that is not healthy for homosexuals. We know that homosexual men tend to not live as long as heterosexual men. We know that people in homosexual relationships tend not to be that happy in those relationships. They are not, most of the time, that emotionally or spiritually fulfilling for them. It is not a healthy environment for them. It's for them, at least it's not a lonely environment. And they are dealing with loneliness. That's what the majority and the Supreme Court case said. Marriage provides an opportunity for a person no longer to be alone. You know, I get that. And so they get something, a relationship, a meaningful relationship out of their marriage or out of that same-sex relationship. And they're looking for that. So they get something out of that, but they also give up a lot in that as well. For one, they give up God's design. We know God has a design. God's design is for a man and a woman to be in a permanent, lifelong, loving relationship. That's God's design. Anything short of that in the sexual relationship falls short of God's design, and therefore people engaged in that are falling short of what God has for them. Plus, there's the entire societal aspect of it. As we devalue marriage by making marriage mean anything, we devalue its meaning even for heterosexuals. So, for example, in some counties in Europe, marriage is almost non-existent because it no longer means anything. And men and women, young men and women especially, are living together, and they're not even bothered with marriage, and they're simply moving back and forth into different relationships. They're having children without getting married. It used to be, even in this country, you know, maybe you'd have one child without being married. Now, 2 or 3 children isn't unusual and still not being married. Those are not stable environments. Those are not environments where a man and a woman have made a commitment to each other, no matter what, to be together, and the children lose something of the stability and the security of knowing their parents are not married. They haven't made that ultimate commitment to each other that marriage represents. And so when we devalue marriage by making it mean anything, it's clear from studies that it basically ends up meaning nothing, and people say there's really it doesn't matter whether you get married or not. And then society itself suffers because the foundation of society is the family rooted in marriage. That's the foundation of society. It's not the individual. The foundation of society is found in that marriage relationship and the children that grow up in that environment. And as the family suffers, and it suffers as marriage suffers, the entire society suffers. So there's a lot at stake.
Yeah, I was at Starbucks, to no one's surprise, here this past week, and that's because that's my office. But anyway, I was leaving Starbucks, and these 2 guys were standing there. This was actually a couple of weeks ago. It was it was the week after the Supreme Court decision, and they stopped me and they wanted to ask me some questions. And I want to ask you just a couple more things, and then we're going to open it up for a few minutes of Q&A from the audience here. But you know, they stopped me, and I don't know, my discernment went up, and the guy said, I would like to ask you a few questions. And I said, well, what's this about? And he said, well, it's about the lesbian and gay community being discriminated in the workforce. And I mean, I have to admit, you know, it really got under my skin. I mean, I'm admitting I said, what do you mean you're being discriminated in the workforce? I mean, that's like a real life situation when you're having to come, you know, how do you, as a believer, I mean, I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but I mean, how do you respond to that in a way to communicate the truth, but also to, you know, to show some grace and love, I guess, and mercy, like you're talking about.
Well,
that's a real life situation.
It is somewhat.
Yeah.
But there isn't that much discrimination against homosexual people in the workplace today, generally speaking. And where it is occurring, it shouldn't occur. And it's illegal to discriminate against a person just in the workplace.
Yeah.
You know, in a for-profit business, for sure, it's illegal to do that. And you can say, you know what? I don't think people in the business community should be discriminated against because they're homosexual either. And you can agree with that. Right. But then you also need to say, but when it's a religious business, when it's a business that's dedicated to its religious values, those should also be respected. And when it's a church or a religious school or some religious ministry that's operating according to its understanding of God's calling on their lives, that also needs to be respected. And there needs to be respect on both sides here. And people of faith shouldn't be forced to give up their faith convictions in order to function within society, in order to fulfill God's calling on their lives, which for many Christians is to run businesses and to open businesses according to their biblical values. And if whatever they're providing as a service has a religious significance to it, I mean, they're not just running the local grocery store, they're not just running the local hotel, but if whatever that service is they're providing is religious in nature, they should also be able to run that business according to their biblical values. So I think you can affirm the fact that they shouldn't be discriminated against in the general business community, but at the same time they should respect the right of people of faith also to be able to operate according to their own convictions.
Good. Well, the last question that I have before we open it up here, you know, you've been around for a while. What's next? You know, what's next? You know, I mean, feel free to share, you know, in about, you know, just a couple of minutes if you can. I mean, I know I've been reading about Planned Parenthood and all the stuff going on with that this past week, which is horrible.
Yes, you know, I'm glad that finally came out. Planned Parenthood has been doing that for years. They've been selling fetal body parts and deliberately figuring out how to remove that baby from the womb in order to preserve the part, you know, that they're planning to sell. So they've been involved in that for a while. I'm glad it's finally coming out. The United States gives over $350 million a year to Planned Parenthood. They have an over $1 billion budget, and almost a third of that comes from tax dollars. Hopefully we can finally stop giving them tax dollars in order to kill a third of all the babies who are born in this country. Planned Parenthood is responsible for over 300,000 abortions every year. Well, they're making plenty of money. They don't need my tax dollars. They don't need your tax dollars to do that. Right. So what I'm hoping is at the very least we stop providing them the tax funding in order to carry on what they do. So, you know, I'm hoping that comes out of that. What's next because of this court decision? I think that John Roberts was absolutely right in his dissent from the majority decision in the Obergefell case. He said one thing you can be sure of is that polygamy is coming, because they have ended the sexual relationship that's involved in marriage of a man and a woman. They've eradicated that. Okay, so marriage is no longer about a man marrying a woman. It's now about people seeking a relationship that gives meaning to life. And so the majority talked about dignity. We need to extend dignity. We need to make sure they have, you know, the same dignity that everybody else gets. And he says, I don't know how you stop 3 people from arguing we can't have that same dignity. We can't have the same acceptance in society if the 3 of us can't get married. So I think he's absolutely right. Now that the court has basically separated the union of a man and a woman from the meaning of marriage, polygamy is on its way. The next is, I think we're going to see Christians marginalized more and more as we get called bigots. And we're going to be called bigots. I was listening to an NPR report on the radio a couple of months ago. And there was this case of a florist. I think she was in Michigan. She was in one of the northern states. And she had a Christian woman working for her. And this florist decided she would start providing flowers for same-sex weddings. And this woman who worked for her, being a dedicated Christian, for her, she said, it's not possible for me to provide that service for a same-sex wedding. And so she quit. She did what you and I would say, well, that's a pretty good thing. She didn't fight for her rights. She simply said, I can't work here anymore under those circumstances, and she quit. The reporter who's reporting on that talked about that, and then she said, and then the reporter said, there are still pockets of religious prejudice related to same-sex marriage. And here this woman was trying to get out of the way is being called a bigot, guilty of religious prejudice because she didn't want to, she didn't feel like she could, in good conscience, participate in providing those flowers for that wedding. So if you can't even quit and get out of the way and not be called a bigot, you know all of those who are trying to live faithfully before the Lord in every area of their lives and try to hold forth God's truth for all of humanity, we're going to be treated as bigots as well. So I think there's going to be some more social marginalization taking place. But it's not something for us to be afraid of. Right. It simply helps create the understanding of the separation between God's design for humanity and for everybody else, and it will cause us to stand out more. And as we stand out more, the difference is going to be more stark between what we believe and how that affects our lives and the way the rest of the world is living. And people will have it clearer for them what it means to be a disciple. Some will want that, some won't. But at least it will be clearer what it means to live for the Lord.
Good, good. Well, Dr. Duke, thank you for all your time. Pastor Jacques, he has a microphone, and we wanted to open it up for you. If you had a question that you would like to ask, maybe something that Dr. Duke shared struck a nerve, you might like. Does anybody have any questions? We'll have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions.
Dr. Duke, thank you for being here today. This has been very valuable. But when I look back at what's happened to our society and our culture in the last 50 or 60 years, I think we have just achieved the biggest trifecta in history. Started with banning prayer in the public schools, picked up again when we authorized and legalized abortion. And now this one, the highest court in the land has said it is the law of the United States of America to recognize gay marriage, something which God has called an abomination. I'm just wondering how much further our society is going to be allowed to slip toward the gutter before God perhaps reaches a tipping point with America, if he hasn't already, and removes his hands of protective blessing from our country. What do you think about that?
In fact, I used to tell folks that we need to pray that God will not judge us for the sin of our nation. I no longer say that anymore because I think we're under judgment already. I think that judgment is slow and it's gradual. And God's turning the heat up to try to get our attention. He did the same thing with Israel. He describes in the book of Amos how he did that, in fact. And God says, look, I did this and I did this and I kept turning the heat up for you and you never got it. You simply turned further away from me, whereas those things of judgment were actually supposed to cause you to understand that you were walking away from me and cause you to turn back to me. You went further from me. And I think that's what we're going through now. I think that we are under God's judgment now. God is just slowly removing his hand of protection, his hand of blessing. And we're supposed to be seeing what's happening as an indication that God is removing that from us so that we would turn back to him. The question is, when will that take place? What will it take to get us back there? I don't know. But I do know that the change can take place at any moment. If you look back on our nation's history, things aren't a lot different than they were in previous times. Now, we've legalized some things that weren't legal before. But if you go back and you look at what people were saying life was like, say just before the 1858 revival across the Northeast, if you go back and look what people were saying just before the Great Awakening in this country under the preaching of Whitefield and Wesley, people were saying very similar things about what people were like. They were complaining about drunkenness. They were complaining about sexuality. They were complaining about all these similar kinds of things that we're seeing today as well. And God's people saw it and they fell on their knees before God, and they called out to God. They got themselves right with God, which is what 2 Chronicles tells us to do, right? If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves. They called on God. They rededicated themselves to God's calling on their lives, and God in an instant like that sent revival and brought this country back from the brink more than once. And so I don't think we're beyond hope, but I do think the judgment of God is returning now. And God's first question is, okay, church, what are you going to do? Are you going to get serious about me, or are you simply going to go along in order to get along? And I think God's first challenge for us today as the church is whether or not we're going to become the people that we're supposed to be, and whether or not then God will respond to that and send the revival, which only He can do, right? Revival is the work of God's Spirit. God needs to release His Spirit over this country again like He has in the past, and only God can do that. But God does that, it would seem, in response to the prayers of His people. So what I say we need to do is not wring our hands, but clasp them again in prayer and humble ourselves before God and see if God won't send us another revival. I think it's possible.
Amen. Any other questions?
Hello, Dr. Duke. There have been some who have developed some different theologies, alternative theologies around the verses that you're talking about in Romans 1, and saying that it's not really he's not really against homosexuality, just certain behaviors and this type of thing. Do you see those types of theologies being embraced by a large number of churches, or is there any validity to those different theologies that are being developed and have been developed out there?
Yeah, and I think that is a danger. I did my PhD. My PhD is in biblical interpretation. My area of expertise, if you want to call it that, in biblical interpretation was Old Testament. So I did my PhD. In fact, you guys are getting ready to study the book of Nehemiah. I did my PhD dissertation on the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. You're going to love the study. Just they're a plug for you.
That's right.
All right. But I've looked at the passages. Okay. I had Greek as well, New Testament as well, in my PhD dissertation. My PhD dissertation was a 90-hour degree. It took me 90 hours of coursework, and then the dissertation after that. And then within that I took Hebrew and I took Greek. I've looked at the Hebrew, I've looked at the Greek. There's no way that you can get out of this what people are saying. Some people are saying, well, those are just prohibitions against forced sex, or those are prohibitions against an adult having sexual relationships with a child. Or other people are saying, well, that's simply within the holiness code, and if you're not part of the Jewish nation, that didn't apply to you. I don't see it. It's very straightforward, it's very clear, and Paul very clearly makes the statement in Romans chapter 1 that homosexual behavior, regardless of whether it's within a religious tradition or outside of the religious tradition, regardless whether it's between consenting adults or not, is contrary to God's design. I don't think there's any other way to read those passages if you'll just be honest. Now, you can make those passages say anything. I can make this Bible say anything I want it to. But if you just go to the Bible with an open mind and let it speak for itself, it will tell you that any sexual activity outside of the relationship, the married relationship between a man and a woman, is sinful. It's that straightforward. I think some churches are going to accept that different interpretation because it makes it possible for them to continue to function without being stigmatized. They're going to feel like it enables them to be more accepted in the community, like it's going to create more opportunity for them then to influence people in the community, when in reality, all it's going to do is make them less relevant. I mean, we have plenty of churches today, right? A lot of the mainline Protestant churches embraced homosexuality a long time ago. They embraced same-sex marriage a long time ago. They're not growing. They're not reaching anybody. In fact, they're dying at the tune of about 1 million members a year collectively. So just to change your theology or change your standards or your policy in order to attract more people, if you actually think that's going to happen, it's not. All the others who have done that have seen the exact opposite happen. It's when we stand for God's truth, even in the midst of opposition, that people see the difference and they're attracted to that because they know that what they have and what they're chasing isn't working, and they're looking for something that will actually work. We need to show them what will actually work and stand by it. And it's those churches that are going to grow and they're going to be effective, especially as the culture continues to decay and people's lives become even more shattered. They're going to look for a sure source of truth, something solid to stand on. They're going to be looking for those people even more. We need to be there as their lives break, and they're looking for somebody to show them a place back to healing. We need to be that place so that we are there and when they come back looking.